The Conditional Finality is the newest raid weapon that drops from the Root of Nightmares raid. I want to start off this review by saying, I really am a fan of the changes Bungie made to how raid exotics drop. The drop rate being tied to triumphs are a great feature that rewards players who have actual mastery for raids. Players who are better versed in an activity should be rewarded for it, and I think this is something the Root of Nightmares does very well, better than every other raid has done. Garden of Salvation, for example, tied their raid drops to a tedious challenge, in which new players today will try to do in their first attempt, resulting in a general dislike for the activity. Other raids remove this feature, only for players to attempt hundreds of runs and still being locked out of the exotic. This new trend of tying raid exotics to triumphs, which started in the Duality Dungeon, is something that I hope continues. I think the next step would be to tell the player base the actual numbers and percentages when it comes to raid drops, but regardless, I think this is a step in the right direction. Now for the actual weapon. Does it live up to the raid exotic status? To be perfectly honest, raid exotics don't have the best reputation when they first launch, and almost every raid exotic has launched underpowered, so the bar isn't exactly that high. Some weapons, such as the Collective Obligation and Vex Mythoclast, did eventually get a buff that made them fitting of the raid exotic name. Those weapons are actually currently very potent in PvE. Others, such as Eyes of Tomorrow and Touch of Malice, are fine, but definitely leave a lot to be desired. I believe one of the things that make a weapon worthy of being a good raid exotic isn't necessarily how powerful it is, but more so what it brings to the table that no other weapon can do. Vex Mythoclast, for example, is a primary fusion rifle, which by itself can be used in a lot of different ways, such as the interactions with the Rain of Fire exotics. Collective Obligation, storing void debuffs, opens the door to the type of void builds you can do for each of the classes. Divinity, creating precision spots, made bosses like Rolk a lot easier to deal with. These are the type of things I would expect to find only in a raid exotic, and I think Conditional Finality does a great job in opening those doors to what you can do with Solar. For those that aren't familiar with how the weapon works, it is a weapon that sits in the kinetic slot, and is labeled as a stasis weapon. Firing and hitting nearly all bullets into an enemy will instantly freeze that target. This in itself is a great interaction, but what makes this weapon so powerful is its next effect. Firing and hitting nearly all the following bullets into an enemy will shoot solar pellets, which will ignite the target. This combination produces a lot of burst damage, as your first bullets will freeze the target and the next ones will shatter and ignite the target all at the same time. Normally, Ignition is the most difficult subclass verb to proc. It requires a lot of ability usage or a lot of rapid incandescent kills to pull off, and there's very few weapons in the game that allow for easy ignitions. Conditional Finality is absolutely the easiest way to proc an ignition, requiring only a single bullet to trigger, which opens the door to a lot of fragments that were otherwise not worth using. Ember of Blistering, for example, was a fragment that gave grenade energy on ignition kills. Ember of Eruption increases the area of effect of an ignition explosion. While these are good fragments to use in general, most solar builds would rather use fragments that allowed for easier ignitions, such as Ember of Ashes, as opposed to fragments that made ignitions more powerful. I believe with this weapon, that's no longer the case. Because of how easy it is to proc an ignition, you can change up how you build into solar. This weapon really does open doors for what you can do with the solar subclass in general. Another great thing about this weapon is how it allows you to effectively run 3 solar weapons into your build. For a normal solar build, you normally had to choose between a solar primary or a solar energy weapon. And unless you were running something like Osmosis, it was difficult to choose anything other than an incandescent primary, which would allow for scorching stacks and chaining Restoration and Radiant with Ember of Empyrean. Ember of Empyrean allowed you to extend Restoration and Radiant by getting kills, and because of how weak primary weapons can be in some content, chaining kills is sometimes not the easiest thing to do. However, thanks to this weapon, it's now much easier to build into a fully solar kit, which allows for easier engagements and easier solar kills. One thing to note is this makes for a better solar weapon than it does a stasis weapon. As a stasis weapon, it does one job. It will instantly freeze the target, which is great. But there's a few things to consider about this. One thing is this freeze effect does not stun Overload champions, because it doesn't apply the slow effect. And another thing is you really need to be within optimal range to pull off the freeze. As good as the freeze effect is, for a Stasis build, I can't justify using this over something like a Chill Clip Riptide or Deliverance, since they not only apply slow and freeze, but they do this at a much greater range. To me, this is really an ignition triggering weapon. It has poor range, but with restoration, it makes it much easier to close gaps and hit those pellets. With a Stasis build, the playstyle is wanting to freeze targets that are outside your range. You rarely want to close the gap with Stasis. You want to keep targets frozen and far away from you. So this isn't really a weapon I'd want to run in a Stasis build personally. That being said, the Conditional Finality is absolutely a top tier weapon in any situation. Ignition is something that gets more benefits on Solar, but it's very effective on any subclass you choose to use it with. I really do recommend knocking out some of those triumphs and doing the Root of Nightmares to get this weapon. So thanks for watching. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, subscribe if you like this type of content, and as always, have a good one.